Some stories feel like legends, whispered across centuries. But when you look closer, they carry a chill that is hard to ignore. The Curse of the Pharaohs is one of those tales. It begins with the discovery of a tomb long buried beneath the sands of Egypt. Soon after, people connected to the excavation began to die under mysterious circumstances. Newspapers called it a curse, a warning left by ancient kings to protect their eternal rest. But was it truly a curse, or simply coincidence, dressed in myth? Tonight, we go back thousands of years to the land of golden deserts and towering pyramids, where secrets sleep beneath the stone zone, where some say the dead are never truly silent. Long before the age of skyscrapers and satellites, before cars roared through city streets and lights chased away the night, there was Egypt, the Egypt of legend, a land where the sun blazed across endless sands, where the Nile carried life through. Deserts that would otherwise have been nothing but dust and wind, and where kings who called themselves pharaohs ruled with the authority of gods. Their temples rose like mountains, their tombs, hidden deep in valleys or sealed beneath pyramids, promised immortality through the ages. To understand the curse, we must first understand the people who might have created it. The pharaohs were not ordinary kings. They believed themselves chosen by the gods, living bridges between the world of men and the realm of the divine. Their power was absolute, their wealth unimaginable. But even they, with all their might, could not escape death. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a doorway, a passage into another existence. They called it the Field of Reeds, a paradise where the Nile flowed forever. Crops grew without end, and life continued in a perfect reflection of earthly pleasures. But to reach this eternal life, a pharaoh needed more than prayers. He needed his body preserved, his tomb filled with treasures, his name spoken through the centuries. The Egyptians believed that as long as a name was remembered, the soul endured. This is why they built tombs so carefully, hiding them away from the living world. The walls were carved with prayers and spells from the Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife. Statues of servants and guardians stood watch, ready to serve the king in the world beyond. And sometimes warnings were written too. Imagine this. Deep in the Valley of the Kings, far from the villages along the Nile, workers carve a tomb out of solid rock. The pharaoh is young, perhaps taken by illness or fate before his time. Priests chant hymns as artisans paint scenes of gods and battles. On the walls, gold gleams in the torchlight as treasures are carried inside. Jewelry, chariots, statues, even food and wine for the journey to eternity. Then the priests seal the entrance, speaking words meant to protect the king's rest. Centuries pass. Sand buries the tomb. Empires rise and fall. The names of the kings fade from memory. But beneath the earth, the body of the pharaoh lies untouched. His treasures sleep beside him. His name waits to be spoken again. Now, imagine someone finding this tomb thousands of years later. A stranger from a distant land, prying open doors never meant to be opened. Shining electric lights where only darkness had reigned. Would the ancient priests have left a warning for such intruders? Would they have written words meant to scare away thieves or those who disturbed the dead? History tells us they did. Curses, or at least warnings that sound like curses, have been found in tombs across Egypt. One inscription from the tomb of Kentucky, an official from around 2200 BC, warned that anyone who entered would be eaten by a crocodile, a snake, and a hippopotamus. Another promised death by scorpions and judgment before the gods. Most of these messages were likely meant to frighten grave robbers, who were a constant threat even in ancient times. Yet when Western explorers arrived in Egypt during the 19th and early 20th centuries, they brought with them a fascination for the supernatural. The Victorians loved ghost stories. They held seances in candlelit rooms. They read novels about vampires and spirits. So when rumors of curses followed the discovery of Egyptian tombs, the public was ready to believe them. But the story that would capture the world's imagination more than any other began with one young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, the boy king. Tutankhamun ruled during the New Kingdom, around 1332 to 1323 BC, but he died very young, perhaps at only 18 or 19. His reign was short, his life a mystery. After his death, he was buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. For centuries, his name was forgotten, his tomb hidden beneath layers of rock and sand. While other tombs were found and plundered in ancient times, Tutankhamun's remained, sealed, waiting in silence. Then came Howard Carter, a British archaeologist with sharp eyes and unshakable determination. Carter had spent years digging in the Valley of the Kings with little to show for it. Many believed all the great tombs had already been discovered. Money was running out. His sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, was close to giving up. But Carter refused to stop searching. He was convinced there was at least one tomb left untouched. In 1922, after years of disappointment, Carter finally found what he had been looking for. A set of steps carved into the rock, leading to a sealed doorway. Behind that doorway lay the tomb of Tutankhamun, perfectly preserved, untouched since the day it was sealed more than 3,000 years earlier. It was the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. Gold, statues, chariots, jewelry, an entire world of treasures glittered in the torchlight. Newspapers called it the find of the age. Crowds gathered to read every update. The world was spellbound by the boy king and his golden mask, his life and death, his tomb filled with wonders. But soon the excitement would turn to fear, because after the tomb was opened, people connected to the discovery began to die. The first was Lord Carnarvon himself, the man who had paid for the entire expedition. He died suddenly in April 1923, just months after the tomb was opened, from an infected mosquito bite. Newspapers were quick to connect his death to a curse. They printed stories of ancient warnings supposedly written on the tomb walls. They hinted at dark forces awakened by the intrusion. And so the legend of the curse of the Pharaohs was born. What began as a single death soon grew into a list. Over the next few years, more people linked to the excavation died unexpectedly. The press reported every detail, fueling the idea that Tutankhamun's tomb carried a deadly secret. But was there really a curse? Or was it all just coincidence and sensational journalism? To answer that, we have to follow the story from the golden sands of Egypt to the halls of science, from ancient inscriptions to modern investigations. We have to look at every death, every theory, every piece of evidence. And that is where our story takes us next. Long before the world heard the name Tutankhamun, before the golden mask became a symbol of ancient mystery, there was a man driven by determination, patience, and a little bit of obsession. His name was Howard Carter. Carter was not born into wealth or privilege. He was born in 1874 in London, the youngest of 11 children in a modest family. He had little formal education, but he loved to draw. That skill would change his life. When he was just 17, he traveled to Egypt, work as an artist for archaeologists, copying the walls of tombs and temples. Under the harsh desert sun, among ruins thousands of years old, Carter found his calling that at first, he was not the one making the discoveries. He was there to record what others found. But as he watched, as he sketched every carving and inscription, he learned the methods of excavation. He learned where to look for hidden tombs, how to read the signs in the rocks and sands, how to spot the faintest clue that something might be buried beneath. And he fell in love with Egypt's past. By the early 1900s, Carter had become more than an artist. He was now an experienced archaeologist, leading his own digs. He had seen temples uncovered, mummies brought to light, and treasures revealed. After thousands of years in darkness, but one dream haunted him, the Valley of the Kings. This was the place where Egypt's greatest rulers had been buried. Dozens of tombs had been discovered there, filled with hieroglyphs and sarcophagi treasures and mysteries. But Carter believed there was one tomb left unfound. One tomb that had escaped the grave robbers of the ancient world and the archaeologists of the modern one. The tomb of a little-known king named Tutankhamun. Most scholars at the time thought Carter was chasing shadows. They believed the valley had given up all its secrets. Tomb after tomb had been opened since the 1800s. Some had been empty, looted centuries earlier. Others held wonders, but nothing like what Carter imagined. The idea that a royal tomb had survived untouched seemed unlikely, but Carter had clues. Small ones, yes, but enough to keep him searching. A cup with Tutankhamun's name had been found years earlier. Fragments of gold leaf bore his titles. These were like whispers from the past, hints that somewhere in the valley, his tomb might still lie hidden. Carter's work was funded by Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy Englishman who loved adventure and history. Carnarvon had the money. Carter had the knowledge. Together they formed a partnership built on hope and determination. Year after year they searched, digging trenches, mapping the valley, following every lead. The work was exhausting. The desert was unforgiving. Heat baked the earth by day, cold winds swept through the valleys by night. Workers swung pickaxes through rock and soil, often finding nothing but sand. Each season ended with disappointment, but Carter refused to quit. By 1922, even Carnarvon was ready to stop. The search had cost a fortune. Other archaeologists whispered that Carter was wasting his time. But Carter convinced Carnarvon to fund one last season, one more chance. And so, in November of that year, Carter's team began digging near the tomb of Ramses VI. Almost immediately, they found something promising, a set of steps cut into the rock, descending toward the earth. The workers cleared the steps, one by one, until they reached a sealed doorway. Here was the moment Carter had dreamed of for decades. Behind that door lay something untouched for over 3,000 years. He sent a message to Carnarvon, who hurried from England to witness the opening. When Carnarvon arrived, the two men stood before the door together. Carter made a small hole in the plaster, lit a candle, and peered inside. Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Those words would become famous around the world. When they finally opened the tomb, what they saw was beyond imagination. Golden couches shaped like animals, chariots with inlaid decorations, statues of gods and pharaohs, jewelry glittering in the light of their lanterns, and deeper inside, a sealed chamber that held the boy king himself. Tutankhamun's tomb was the first nearly intact royal burial ever discovered from ancient Egypt. The world erupted with excitement. Newspapers sent reporters to the Valley of the King's. Photographs of the treasures filled front pages. People everywhere spoke the name Tutankhamun, a king almost unknown before, now transformed into a legend overnight. But even in the glow of discovery, whispers began. Some said a curse guarded the tomb. Stories spread of warnings carved on the walls, threats against anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Most archaeologists dismissed this as nonsense. They were men of science, after all, not superstition. Still, there was no denying the sense of awe inside the tomb. Imagine stepping where no one had walked in 3 millennia, seeing objects last touched by hands that lived and died before Rome, before Greece, before most of human history as we know it. The air inside was heavy, still, as if the past itself was holding its breath. Carter and his team began cataloging everything. It took months to photograph, document, and remove the treasures carefully. Each artifact told a story about the boy king and his world. Gold masks, carved thrones, weapons, clothing, even food and wine left for the afterlife, preserved by the dry Egyptian climate, as if time itself had stopped. But outside the tomb, the modern world was hungry for drama. Reporters knew a good story when they saw one, and the idea of a curse made better headlines than archaeology ever could. When Lord Carnarvon, the man who had paid for the expedition, died suddenly in April 1923, the press exploded with speculation. Was it coincidence? Or was it the curse of the pharaohs taking revenge? More deaths followed. Not all at once, but enough to keep the story alive in newspapers and conversations across Europe and America. Each time someone connected to the tomb passed away, the legend grew. People began to believe the ancient kings had left behind more than gold and glory. They had left a warning. But before we explore the deaths, the theories, and the science behind the curse, we must understand the full list of events that followed the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. Because only by seeing the entire picture can we decide whether this was truly the work of angry gods or simply the strange hand of fate. And that is where our story will turn next. The opening of Tutankhamun's tomb was unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. For centuries, Egypt had fascinated travelers with its pyramids, mummies, and hieroglyphs carved into temples. But this was different. This was not just another tomb. This was the burial of a king who had slept undisturbed for over 3,000 years. And now his world was coming back into the light. Inside the tomb, Howard Carter and his team found more than gold. They found history frozen in time. Every object had a purpose, every carving a meaning. Egyptian tombs were not just places for the dead. They were designed as homes for eternity, filled with everything a pharaoh might need in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was a journey, and the tomb was the starting point. As the team moved through the chambers, they recorded every detail. Walls painted with scenes of gods guiding the king into the next world. Statues of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, standing guard over treasure chests. Carved shrines covered in gold leaf, each containing sacred symbols and texts from the Book of the Dead. The air was dry and still, the silence heavy, as if the tomb itself was holding its breath after so many centuries. Among the treasures was the golden mask that would become famous around the globe. It was placed over the king's mummified face, crafted with such skill and beauty that even modern jewelers marveled at it. There were thrones decorated with scenes of the young king and his queen, alabaster jars holding perfumes and oils, even chariots ready for him to ride in the afterlife. Each item told a story of a royal life, cut short, but honored with splendor. In death, but along with the treasures, came the stories of warnings. Some newspapers claimed that Carter's team had found inscriptions threatening anyone who disturbed the king's rest. Words like "death shall come on swift wings to him who dares enter this sacred tomb" appeared in headlines across the world. Readers imagined ancient priests carving curses into stone, invoking the wrath of gods against intruders. The truth, however, was more complicated. No actual curse was written on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. Archaeologists who examined every inch of the site found no such inscription. Most of the supposed curses came from earlier tombs, some dating back centuries before Tutankhamun. One tomb belonging to a nobleman warned that anyone entering would be destroyed by crocodiles, serpents, and scorpions. Another promised divine judgment for thieves. These warnings were real, but they were not in the boy king's tomb. Still, the absence of a written curse did not stop the rumors. Reporters loved the idea of a deadly warning hidden among the treasures. It made for dramatic stories that sold. Newspapers from London to New York. The public, already fascinated by Egypt's mysteries, embraced the legend eagerly. The more people talked about the curse, the more powerful it seemed to become. Part of the reason the curse story spread so quickly was the death of Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy patron who had funded the entire expedition, only a few months after. The tomb was opened. He died from an infected mosquito bite. It might have been an ordinary accident, but to a world hungry for mystery, it looked like proof of supernatural vengeance. Some even claimed that at the moment of his death, all the lights in Cairo went out. Others whispered that his dog in England howled and died at the same hour, as if the curse had reached across continents. None of these stories could be confirmed, but they appeared in newspapers anyway. Each tale made the curse seem more real. Soon, lists of victims began to circulate. A dozen people connected to the excavation were said to have died in the years following the discovery. Some deaths were sudden, others from illness or accidents, but the legend treated them all the same. Scientists and skeptics argued that the deaths were not unusual. Many people involved with the excavation lived long lives, including Howard Carter himself, who survived nearly 2 decades after opening the tomb. But logic and statistics could not compete with the thrill of a curse from ancient times. The public preferred the mystery. As Carter's team continued their work, they found more. Rooms filled with treasures. The burial chamber itself contained a series of nested shrines and coffins, each layer hiding the king's body deeper within. The outermost shrine was nearly 16 feet long and made of gilded wood. Inside it were 3 more shrines, each smaller than the last, like a set of Russian dolls made of gold. Within the final coffin, carved from solid gold, lay the mummified body of Tutankhamun. The boy king had died young, probably before his 19th birthday. His death ended a short reign during a turbulent time in Egypt's history. Some evidence suggested he had been sickly, possibly suffering from malaria or a genetic disorder. Others speculated about accidents or even murder. The truth remains uncertain, but his early death meant his tomb was smaller than those of other pharaohs. Ironically, this may have helped preserve it. Larger tombs attracted robbers in ancient times, while Tutankhamun's modest resting place remained hidden under rubble and debris, escaping notice for centuries. As the artifacts were removed and studied, the world learned more about life in ancient Egypt. The jewelry revealed craftsmanship of astonishing skill. The weapons and chariots showed the importance of war and hunting to the royal court. Even the food offerings, baskets of grain and dried meats, spoke of beliefs about the afterlife as a continuation of earthly pleasures. Yet despite the historical value of these discoveries, the legend of the curse overshadowed everything else. Reporters followed every illness, every accident, every misfortune linked to anyone who had entered the tomb. Some claimed Carter's canary had been eaten by a cobra the day the tomb was opened, a sign of bad luck in a land where the cobra symbolized royalty and protection. Others repeated tales of mysterious illnesses among workers and visitors. Most archaeologists dismissed these stories as superstition, but they spread quickly among the public. People wanted to believe that the ancient world still held powers beyond modern science, that a king who ruled 3,000 years ago could reach across time to punish those who disturbed him. The idea of the curse became so popular that it inspired books, plays, and eventually movies. The image of the mummy's revenge entered Western culture, mixing real history with fantasy. Soon, the word pharaoh itself carried a sense of danger in popular imagination, as if every Egyptian tomb hid a sleeping power waiting to strike. Through it all, Howard Carter kept working. He catalogued thousands of objects, carefully recording their positions and conditions. The excavation took nearly a decade to complete. Piece by piece, Tutankhamun's world was carried out of the tomb and into museums where it would amaze audiences for generations. But the deaths connected to the discovery continued to attract attention. Each time someone linked to the excavation died, the legend grew stronger. Scientists searched for natural explanations, suggesting that ancient bacteria or toxic molds sealed inside the tomb might have caused illnesses. Others argued that statistics showed no unusual number of deaths at all. The debate between mystery and science had begun, and it would follow the story of the curse for decades. When Lord Carnarvon arrived in Egypt in the autumn of 1922, he was filled with excitement. For years, he had financed Howard Carter's work in the Valley of the Kings, writing checks while hoping for results. Now, at last, his gamble had paid off. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was everything he had dreamed of. Ancient treasures, worldwide fame, and a legacy that would outlive them all. But only a few months later, in April 1923, Carnarvon was dead. His death became the moment when whispers of a curse turned into a roar. Newspapers from London to New York printed stories, suggesting that ancient powers had taken revenge for disturbing the pharaoh's rest. They claimed that the tomb carried a warning, that the gods had struck down the man who funded the expedition. The reality was less dramatic, but no less tragic. Carnarvon had been staying at the luxurious Winter Palace Hotel in Luxor, enjoying the warmth of the Egyptian spring after a long winter in England. One evening, he was bitten on the face by a mosquito. At first, it seemed harmless. Mosquito bites were common in Egypt. But Carnarvon had a habit of shaving closely, and when he cut the bite with his razor, the small wound became infected. Medical care in 1923 was not what it is today. Antibiotics like penicillin had not yet been discovered. Infections that are easily treated now could become deadly then. Carnarvon developed a high fever, chills, and eventually pneumonia. Despite the efforts of doctors, he grew weaker and weaker. On April 5, 1923, he died at the age of 50-6. Almost immediately, rumors exploded. Some claimed that all the lights in Cairo went out at the moment of his death, plunging the city into darkness as if the pharaoh himself had reached out. From the past, others whispered that his favorite dog, far away in England, howled and dropped dead at the same hour. These stories were never proven, but they spread quickly, carried by journalists eager for sensational headlines. The idea of a curse fit perfectly with the public imagination. Here was a man who had opened a tomb sealed for 3,000 years, now dead within months. It seemed like a warning from another age, a story too perfect to ignore. Reporters called it the Curse of the Pharaohs, and the name stuck. Carnarvon's death was only the beginning. Over the next few years, other people connected to the tomb also died, sometimes suddenly, sometimes from illness or accidents. A wealthy American visitor to the site died of pneumonia soon after returning home. Another member of the excavation team died of blood poisoning. Each time, the newspapers linked the death to the curse, building a legend one headline at a time. Scientists and archaeologists pushed back. They pointed out that dozens of people had entered the tomb, yet most lived long, healthy lives. Howard Carter himself, the man who spent more time in the tomb than anyone else, lived until 1939, nearly 17 years after its discovery. The chief anatomist who examined Tutankhamun's body lived into his 70s. If there was a curse, they argued, it was strangely selective. But logic and statistics could not compete with mystery. The 1920s were a time of spiritualism and fascination with the supernatural. Seances were popular in Europe and America. People believed in ghosts, psychic powers, and life after death. The idea of a pharaoh's curse fit perfectly into this world of Ouija boards and haunted houses. Some even claimed that Carnarvon's death had been predicted. Fortune-tellers and mystics came forward saying they had warned of danger before the tomb was opened. Whether these claims were true or invented, afterward did not matter. They added fuel to the fire. Writers and playwrights joined in, turning the story into novels and stage productions. Soon, the image of the vengeful mummy entered popular culture, mixing ancient history with modern fear. The idea that Egypt's kings could reach across time to punish intruders became part of the legend, repeated in books, films, and radio dramas for decades. But behind the myths and mysteries was a real man whose death had left a void. Carnarvon had not only financed the expedition, but had also helped manage the flood of publicity that followed the discovery. With him gone, control over access to the tomb shifted to Egyptian authorities and the academic world. Carter continued the work, but the atmosphere had changed. The excavation itself was massive. Tutankhamun's tomb contained more than 5,000 artifacts, from golden shrines to simple jars of wine. Cataloging everything took nearly 10 years. Each object had to be photographed, described, and packed for transport. The work was slow and careful, watched by officials and scholars from around the world. Meanwhile, the list of supposed victims grew. The press reported that a former Egyptian prince who had visited the tomb was assassinated in London. A radiologist who had taken X-rays of the mummy died suddenly. Even Carter's secretary was said to have succumbed to the curse after a sudden illness. In reality, many of these deaths had ordinary explanations, but the pattern seemed convincing. To those who wanted to believe, doctors offered scientific theories. Some suggested that deadly fungi or bacteria might have survived inside the sealed tomb for centuries, released when the air was disturbed. Studies decades later found traces of toxic molds on ancient walls and artifacts. Inhaling them could, in theory, cause respiratory illness, though there was little evidence connecting this to the deaths in the 1920s. Others pointed out that life expectancy in the early 20th century was much shorter than today. People often died from infections, accidents, and diseases that modern medicine can treat easily. The idea that every death was supernatural ignored the simple reality of health in the 1920s, yet the curse story refused to die. It was too dramatic, too mysterious, too full of coincidence to let go. Each time another death was reported, the legend grew stronger. Readers loved the idea that ancient Egypt still held powers beyond science and reason. By the time the excavation ended in 1932, the curse of the Pharaohs had become part of modern mythology. Movies like The Mummy, released in 1932, turned the idea into horror fiction. Writers blended fact and fantasy until the real history of Tutankhamun's tomb and the imagined curse became almost inseparable in the public mind. Howard Carter, who had spent 10 years excavating and documenting every artifact, lived long enough to see both the scientific value of his work and the lasting power of the legend it created. He died of natural causes at the age of 64, far outliving the curse that was supposed to claim everyone connected to the tomb. Still, the death of Lord Carnarvon remained at the center of the story. Without his sudden and dramatic end, the curse might never have become famous. His passing gave the legend its first victim, its first proof, its first sense of fear. Even today, when historians explain the real causes and dismiss the curse as coincidence, the image of the wealthy patron struck down after opening up Pharaoh's tomb continues to fascinate anyone who hears the tale. The legend was born in that moment, in April 1923, and it has never truly faded. As the years passed after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, the legend of the Pharaoh's curse continued to grow. It spread far beyond Egypt, across Europe and America, carried by newspapers hungry for dramatic headlines and by audiences eager for tales of ancient mystery. Each new death linked to the excavation was added to the list, whether the connection was real or imagined. The line between history and superstition blurred until even scholars had to respond to questions about whether the curse was real, yet beneath the layers of fear and rumor. Another story was unfolding, a story about science, coincidence, and the human need for meaning in the face of death. One of the key figures in this debate was Howard Carter himself. As the man who had led the discovery, he had little patience for talk of curses. He was a practical man, methodical and stubborn, focused on cataloging and preserving the treasures of the tomb. When journalists asked him about the curse, he dismissed it as nonsense invented by people who did not understand archaeology. Carter pointed out that hundreds of people had entered the tomb over the years: workers, scholars, photographers, even tourists, and most was still alive. If a curse truly existed, why had it claimed only a handful? The pattern, he argued, was one of chance, not supernatural wrath. But the public was not convinced. Stories about curses were far more exciting than explanations about bacteria or coincidence. When a British nobleman who had visited the tomb died in a car accident, the headlines called it the Pharaoh's Revenge. When an American financier who had funded parts of the excavation died suddenly, the newspapers whispered about ancient powers at work. One of the most famous cases involved Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who had taken X-ray images of Tutankhamun's mummy shortly after its discovery. He died a few years later, and the press eagerly added his name to the supposed victim list. Scientists pointed out that his death had nothing to do with the tomb. But the curse legend did not require proof, only mystery. Some researchers offered alternative theories to explain the deaths without invoking magic. In the 1920s and 1930s, doctors speculated that sealed tombs might contain deadly molds or pathogens. After centuries in darkness, these microorganisms could, in theory, cause infections when the air was disturbed. Modern studies have found traces of fungi, such as on ancient artifacts. In people with weak immune systems, exposure can cause respiratory illness. Could this explain some of the deaths linked to the tomb? Perhaps. But the evidence remained thin. Most people who entered Tutankhamun's tomb lived long, healthy lives. The curse, if it existed, seemed oddly selective. Another explanation came from psychology rather than biology. The discovery of the tomb was the most famous archaeological event of its time, followed by the press around the world. When someone connected to it died even years later, people noticed. Countless others, unconnected to the tomb, died in similar ways without anyone suggesting supernatural causes. The curse legend, psychologists argued, was an example of confirmation. Bias. The human tendency to see patterns where none exist, but facts and logic rarely defeat mystery. In the 1920s, spiritualism was at its peak in Europe and America. Seances, fortune-telling, and ghost stories were popular entertainment. Many people believed in life after death and the power of the spirit world. Against this cultural background, the idea of an ancient curse felt plausible, even inevitable. Writers and filmmakers helped keep the legend alive. In 1923, only months after Carnarvon's death, the first stage play about the curse appeared in London. By the 1930s, Hollywood had discovered the story, creating films filled with vengeful mummies and dark magic. These fictional versions bore little resemblance to the real history of Tutankhamun's tomb, but they shaped public imagination for generations. The curse also attracted the attention of famous writers. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, suggested that might have been killed by elementals, spirits set to guard the tomb. Doyle was fascinated by the supernatural and often defended spiritualism against skeptics. His comments gave the curse theory a boost, especially because he was already a respected public figure. Yet not everyone agreed. Many archaeologists grew frustrated with the constant talk of curses. They feared it made serious science look like superstition. For them, the tomb was a priceless window into ancient Egypt, a site that revealed art, culture, and history, not ghosts and magic. The Egyptian authorities had their own perspective. Some officials welcomed the curse legend because it discouraged looting. Tomb raiding had plagued Egypt for centuries, with thieves seeking gold and artifacts to sell on the black market. If foreigners believed in a deadly curse, perhaps they would think twice before stealing from ancient graves. Meanwhile, work inside the tomb continued slowly and carefully. Carter and his team spent nearly a decade documenting every object. There were golden shrines, jeweled necklaces, statues of gods, chariots, and even simple everyday items like sandals and walking sticks. Each artifact told a story about life and death in the age of the pharaohs. Tutankhamun himself became the most famous pharaoh in history. Not because of his reign, he ruled for only about 9 years, but because of his tomb's discovery. Before 1922, he was a little-known king from a turbulent period of Egyptian history. Afterward, his name was known around the world, linked forever to gold, mystery, and the curse. By the time Carter finished his work in 1932, the legend of the curse had taken on a life of its own. It no longer mattered whether scientists dismissed it or whether statistics disproved it. The story had everything: ancient kings, hidden treasures, sudden deaths, and the possibility that some powers lie beyond human understanding. Even today, a century later, the debate continues. Modern researchers analyzing the tomb and its artifacts find no evidence of supernatural danger. DNA studies of the mummy suggest Tutankhamun died from illness or injury, not magic. Yet the legend survives because it speaks to something deeper than science. It reminds us that the past can still surprise us, that ancient mysteries can reach across time to capture the imagination in the end. The curse of the Pharaohs may have less to do with ancient gods than with human nature itself. We are storytellers by instinct, weaving meaning from coincidence, fear from tragedy, and mystery from history. The deaths connected to Tutankhamun's tomb were real, but the curse that linked them was a creation of rumor, culture, and the eternal human love of a good story. And perhaps that is why the legend endures. Facts can be proven or disproven, but legends live in the space between reality and belief, where doubt and wonder meet. The curse of the Pharaohs belongs to that space forever, balanced between coincidence and mystery, science and superstition, history and myth. As the decades passed, the legend of the Pharaoh's curse refused to fade. It became part of global culture, retold in books, films, and whispered conversations whenever ancient Egypt was mentioned. Children learned about it in school. Travelers visited Egypt hoping to see the tomb that had started it all. Tour guides, eager to entertain, repeated the tales of death and mystery, adding new twists with every generation. But the legacy of the curse reached far beyond tourism or storytelling. It changed the way the world looked at archaeology, at history, and at the silent power of the ancient world. After Howard Carter completed his work in Tutankhamun's tomb, the artifacts began to travel. Some went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Others toured internationally, drawing millions of visitors. Everywhere they went, the curse followed in newspaper headlines and public imagination. When the treasures of Tutankhamun were exhibited in London in the 1970s, crowds stretched around the block. People came to see the golden mask, the jeweled daggers, the statues of gods and kings. The exhibition became one of the most popular in British history. But beneath the excitement lingered the familiar question: was the curse still watching? In one famous incident during the London exhibition, a curator suffered a heart attack while handling one of the artifacts. Newspapers immediately revived the curse story. Scientists called it coincidence, but the legend gained new strength. Some visitors admitted feeling uneasy, as if the ancient king disapproved of his treasures being displayed far from his tomb. Meanwhile, Egypt itself changed dramatically in the 20th century. National pride in its ancient heritage grew stronger. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had shown the world the brilliance of ancient Egyptian civilization. Temples, pyramids, and artifacts became symbols of identity, reminding Egyptians that their history stretched back thousands of years before modern nations even existed. For the Egyptian government, the curse was both a problem and an opportunity. On one hand, officials wanted to present archaeology as a serious science, not a playground for superstition. On the other hand, the mystery attracted tourists, and tourism brought money. A little fear, it seemed, was good for business, as long as it stayed on the level of legend, not panic. Hollywood played its part as well. Films like The Mummy turned the curse into a permanent part of popular culture. These movies mixed fragments of real history with fantasy, creating stories of undead priests, ancient magic, and doomed adventurers. None of it matched the truth of Tutankhamun's tomb, but it kept audiences fascinated. The idea of a curse had become bigger than any single discovery. It was now a myth about the entire ancient world. Writers, too, used the curse as inspiration. Novels set in Egypt often included mysterious deaths, warnings written in hieroglyphs, or vengeful spirits haunting those who disturbed sacred ground. Even comic books and radio dramas picked up the theme. The Pharaoh's curse became a kind of shorthand for forbidden knowledge and human arrogance before the power of the past. Yet in academic circles, researchers pushed back. Archaeologists pointed out that no curse had ever been found written on Tutankhamun's tomb walls. Some tombs in Egypt did have inscriptions warning thieves or invaders, but Tutankhamun's was silent. The idea of a deadly warning, they argued, came from modern imagination rather than ancient reality. Medical studies offered other explanations. When scientists examined the tomb environment decades later, they found traces of mold, spores, and bacteria. Some species, under the right conditions, can produce toxins harmful to humans. Could these have caused illness among early visitors? Possibly, but again, most people who entered the tomb suffered no harm. Statistical studies added another layer. Researchers compared the lifespans of people involved in Tutankhamun's excavation with those of others from the same era and profession. The results showed no significant difference. In fact, Howard Carter himself lived nearly 20 years after opening the tomb, dying at the age of 64. If the curse existed, it seemed strangely selective. But logic and data rarely destroy a good story. The curse lived on because it touched something deeper than evidence. It spoke to the feeling that some places should remain untouched, that ancient kings might resent being disturbed, that history itself carries a kind of sacred weight. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, interest in ancient Egypt exploded again with new technology. CT scans and DNA analysis allowed scientists to study mummies without unwrapping them. Satellite imaging revealed hidden structures beneath the desert sands. Yet even with all this progress, the legend of the curse continued to appear in documentaries, news articles, and travel brochures. One reason may be that the curse fits into a much older pattern in human history. Many cultures have stories about sacred sites bringing misfortune to those who violate them. From Greek myths about vengeful gods to medieval tales of haunted castles, the theme repeats across time and geography. The Pharaoh's curse simply became the most famous, modern version. Some scholars even argue that the cursed legend shaped attitudes toward archaeology itself. In earlier centuries, explorers often treated ancient sites carelessly, breaking artifacts or removing treasures with little respect. After Tutankhamun, public awareness grew. People began to see tombs not just as sources of gold or museum pieces, but as parts of a cultural heritage deserving protection. In this sense, the curse may have helped preserve history. Fear of supernatural punishment made people cautious. Laws about excavation and artifact ownership became stricter. Egypt demanded the return of artifacts taken abroad. International organizations pushed for ethical archaeology, emphasizing study over treasure hunting. By the early 21st century, Tutankhamun's treasures had become symbols of global heritage. Museums displayed them with advanced security and climate control. Teams of experts monitored their condition, ensuring they would survive for future generations. The legend of the curse still appeared in headlines, but now it stood alongside discussions about conservation, science, and respect for the past. Tourists visiting the Valley of the Kings today hear both stories: the real history of reign and burial, and the legend of the curse that followed his discovery. Guides point out where Carter's team worked, describe the moment the tomb was opened, and mention the mysterious deaths that came after. Visitors listen, half believing, half skeptical, caught between fascination with the past and the modern world's demand for evidence. Perhaps that tension is what keeps the curse alive. It exists in the space between history and myth, between science and imagination. People do not want the mystery solved completely. A world with no secrets feels smaller, less magical. The curse gives the past a voice, even if it is only a whisper invented by modern minds. As Tutankhamun's treasures continue to travel the world in exhibitions, as documentaries retell the story with dramatic music and shadowy tomb scenes, as writers and filmmakers add new twists, the legacy of the curse grows. It has become part of how we remember the discovery itself, shaping the story long after the real events ended. In the end, the curse of the Pharaohs may be less about ancient Egypt than about us. It reveals our hunger for wonder, our fear of death, our respect for mystery. It shows how history and legend can intertwine until separating them no longer matters. The boy king buried in the Valley of the Kings could never have imagined this fate, that his tomb would make him immortal not through magic or power, but through the stories people tell about him 1,000 years later. And those stories, like the desert winds over the pyramids, show no sign of stopping. In the 21st century, the story of the Pharaoh's curse entered a new chapter. Science advanced, technology opened doors unimagined in Carter's time, and yet the legend refused to fade. Instead, it adapted, living side by side with modern investigation. One of the biggest changes came from medical science. For decades, theories about poison, bacteria, or toxic gases inside the tomb had swirled around the curse legend. With modern tools, researchers began to test these ideas directly. They took air samples from sealed chambers, analyzed mummy wrappings under microscopes, and even examined ancient resins for chemical properties. Some results surprised them. Certain molds, like Aspergillus, can indeed release spores harmful to people with weak immune systems. Others suggested that bat droppings inside sealed tombs could produce ammonia and other irritants over centuries. It was not hard to imagine an unlucky visitor breathing in such air and falling ill later. Yet science also revealed limits to these explanations. The majority of Carter's team, including those who spent the most time inside the tomb, lived long, healthy lives. If toxins were present, they did not strike consistently. Modern researchers concluded that while health risks existed, they could not fully explain the pattern or lack of pattern behind the so-called cursed deaths. Meanwhile, historians re-examined old records. Letters, diaries, and newspapers from the 1920s were studied carefully. Some claims about the curse turned out to be exaggerated or even invented. For example, the famous story that Lord Carnarvon's dog howled and died at the exact moment of his master's death in Egypt came from a single reporter's account. Later evidence suggested the tale was likely fiction. Other supposed victims of the curse were found to have died years or even decades after visiting the tomb. When all the data were gathered, the death list looked far less convincing than early headlines had suggested. Yet the legend persisted, because mystery often survives facts. People enjoy stories that hint at forces beyond human control. The curse offered exactly that, a sense that ancient Egypt still held power over the modern world, that some doors should remain closed. Archaeology itself continued to evolve. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hidden chambers near to tomb. DNA testing identified royal mummies, uncovering family secrets from thousands of years ago. CT scans of Tutankhamun's body showed he likely died from a combination of illness and injury, not from murder, as some had speculated. Each discovery solved one mystery, but left others untouched. Who built the tomb in such haste? Why were some treasures missing compared to other royal burials? Why did Tutankhamun die so young? Questions like these kept the fascination alive, feeding the same imagination that sustained the curse legend. In recent years, Egypt has invested heavily in preserving and displaying its ancient heritage. The Grand Egyptian Museum, near the pyramids of Giza, promises to house Tutankhamun's treasures in state-of-the-art conditions. When it opens fully, visitors will see the golden mask, the chariots, the jewelry, every artifact together, for the first time since Carter's discovery. Even now, as the artifacts prepare for their new home, journalists mention the curse in headlines. It has become a tradition. Anytime Tutankhamun's name appears in news stories, the curse follows, like a shadow that never fades. Television documentaries keep the legend alive as well. Some take a skeptical approach, interviewing scientists and historians who dismiss the curse as myth. Others lean into the drama, using ominous music and reenactments to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the ancient warning was real. Viewers watch both kinds, because part of them wants answers, while another part prefers the mystery unsolved. Writers and filmmakers have taken the curse far beyond Egypt. Novels place it in modern cities, turning museum curators or archaeologists into victims of ancient vengeance. Movies mix it with romance, adventure, or horror, creating stories where the past refuses to stay buried. The real curse may be the way the legend spreads, unstoppable, through every form of storytelling. Psychologists offer an interesting perspective on why the curse endures. Humans, they say, are drawn to patterns. When something bad happens after a significant event, like opening a tomb, our minds link the two. Even if no real connection exists, it gives random tragedy a sense of meaning, as if the universe itself were enforcing justice. The curse legend also touches something deeper: respect for the dead. Across cultures, disturbing graves has long carried spiritual danger. From Europe's haunted castles to Asia's ancestral tombs, stories warn against ignoring the boundary between the living and the dead. The Pharaoh's curse fits perfectly into this global tradition. In Egypt today, archaeologists work with careful rituals. Before entering tombs, they document everything, use advanced equipment, and often consult with local communities. The days of smashing walls or removing treasures casually are over. Some of this change comes from science and law. Some, perhaps, comes from a lingering sense reel or imagine that the past watches those who enter its secrets. As for Tutankhamun himself, his image has traveled the world. The golden mask appears on posters, book covers, even coffee mugs. He has become the face of ancient Egypt, more famous in death than he ever was in life. Without the discovery of his tomb, without the cursed legend, he might have remained a forgotten minor king among many others. In that sense, the curse gave him immortality, not through magic or divine power, but through global fascination. People who know nothing else about Egyptian history still recognize his mask, his name, and the story of the tomb that seemed to punish those who opened it. Modern science may eventually explain every mystery. It may prove beyond doubt that the deaths were coincidence, that no ancient magic existed, that the only real dangers were bacteria and bad luck. But even then, the legend will likely remain, because the curse, in the end, is not about facts. It is about wonder. It is about the feeling that history holds secrets bigger than ourselves, that time itself whispers warnings we cannot fully understand. As long as humans crave mystery, as long as deserts keep their silence and tombs keep their shadows, the curse will live in headlines, in movies, in late-night conversations when the wind rattles the windows. And somewhere, deep in the valley of the kings, the boy king sleeps on, surrounded by treasures meant to last forever, while the world above tells and retells the story of what happened when his tomb was opened under the burning Egyptian sun. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.